Bogart, the man, the myth, the enigma, the cinematic shadow. By the late 1930s, the golden age of the perfect leading man was fracturing. Hollywood was built on simple certainties and pristine heroes, but the world was becoming a much darker place, and the industry didn't know who belonged in it anymore. Then, in 1941, a man walked out of the fog of a San Francisco pier and provided the answer. He was short, he had a slight lisp, and at 41 years old, he was at an age when most actors were fading into the background. This wasn't just a new role, it was the birth of Bogart Protocol. Most people think they know Humphrey Bogart because they've seen the iconic trench coat, the fedora, and the cigarette smoke. We've been told for 80 years that he was the ultimate tough guy. But just like the unsinkable Titanic we investigated last time, the image Hollywood built for Bogart was a carefully constructed lie. Before he was the hero of Casablanca, he was Hollywood's professional corpse. He spent a decade dying in the shadows of B-movies so that bigger stars could shine. Today, we aren't just looking at a biography. We are conducting a forensic investigation into a man who was actually a high society chess master and a Navy veteran, a man who outplayed the studio system to become a legend. To find the truth, we have to look at the films the studio wants you to forget, and the buckling rivets of a career that almost ended before it began. The Western Purgatory, the visual failure. To understand the Bogart Code, you have to see him at his absolute worst. We have to go back to 1939, a year when Warner Brothers was the most powerful factory of dreams in the world. They had a formula for everything, and they tried to apply that formula to Humphrey Bogart by putting him in a cowboy hat. Look at the footage from the Oklahoma Kid. If we look at this through a forensic lens, it is one of the most jarring sights in cinematic history. Bogart is dressed in an oversized black hat, a literal black hat villain. Beside him is James Cagney, looking equally out of place. This is what we call Western Purgatory. The studio saw Bogart as a type, the two-bit gangster who gets shot in the final reel. They thought the frontier was the only place for an outlaw. But if you look closely at his performance in The Oklahoma Kid or Virginia City, you see the forensic evidence of a man who doesn't belong. While the Western is a genre of wide-open spaces and simple morality, Bogart's face is a map of city streets and internal conflict. Look at the way he carries himself on the horse. He looks uncomfortable in the sun. In every frame, his body language screams that he's waiting for the lights to go out so the real work can begin. The studio heads, led by Jack Warner, were trying to force a 20th century soul into a 19th century box. They were looking for a white hat hero, but Bogart was already something else. He was the first hero of the anxiety era. He was a man who looked like he had already seen the end of the world and was just waiting for the rest of us to catch up. This Western Purgatory nearly ended him. He was a buckling rivet in the Hollywood machine, a man whose talent was too heavy for the flimsy scripts he was given. In these films, Bogart isn't playing a character. He's a man trapped in a genre that doesn't have a language for him yet. He was being punished for being different, for having a face that looked like it had been through a war rather than a photo shoot. The studio didn't realize that the very thing they were trying to hide, the stillness, the intellectual weariness, were exactly what the post-war world was going to crave. The Chess Master's Gambit, the 1941 breakout. The lock finally broke in 1941, and it didn't break because of luck. It broke because Bogart played a better game of chess than the studio. In the late 1930s, Bogart was trapped in a contract that treated him like a piece of equipment. He was loaned out and cast down. But he spent his nights at the Hollywood Chess Club, playing master-level games against some of the best minds in the city. He wasn't just passing time, He was honing a philosophy of life. In chess, you don't win by being the strongest. You win by being the most observant. You win by anticipating the opponent's move before they even know they're going to make it. He waited for High Sierra. In this film, Bogart plays Roy Earle, an aging gangster released from prison into a world that has moved on without him. This is the first time we see the forensic Bogart. Look at the scene where he stands on the mountain, knowing the police are closing in. He isn't playing a villain. He's playing a man trapped by his own history. He brought a sense of doomed dignity to the role that Jack Warner didn't expect. He showed that an outlaw could have a soul, even if it was a scarred one. Then came a turning point, the Maltese Falcon. This is where the modern outlaw was born. Watch the way Bogart moves as Sam Spade. He's fast, he's cynical, and he doesn't trust a soul. This wasn't just acting, it was a reflection of Bogart's real-life philosophy. He took the lisp and the lip scar, physical flaws that the studio's makeup artist tried to hide, and he turned them into a weapon. If you freeze-frame the moment Bogart's Sam Spade walks into his office and finds Bridget O'Shaughnessy, you are seeing the birth of the 20th century hero. He isn't a white-hat cowboy. He's a man who knows that everyone is lying to him, and he's okay with that. He proved that the modern outlaw didn't need a horse or a frontier. He just needed a deck of cards and a brain that worked faster than yours. By the time he reached the final scene, holding the stuff that dreams are made of, Bogart had successfully broken the lock. He had moved the frontier from the plains of Oklahoma to the fog-drenched streets of San Francisco. The War of the Scar, the human reality. But there is a deeper, more forensic layer to this story that Hollywood tried to rewrite. They wanted us to believe Bogart's toughness was just a script, a persona created by writers like John Huston. The truth is far more heroic and far darker. During World War I, long before he ever stepped in front of a camera, Humphrey Bogart served in the US Navy on the USS Leviathan. This wasn't a Hollywood version of service. It was the real thing. That signature lisp and the scarred upper lip. The studio's publicity department spent years inventing stories about it. They said it was a childhood accident, or a splinter from a toy. The forensic reality is likely much grimmer. A piece of shrapnel, or a prisoner's strike during his naval service. Bogart carried the literal scars of the old world's collapse on his face every time he walked onto a soundstage. He was a man who had seen the raw machinery of war, and it gave him a stillness that no other actor could replicate. He wasn't acting tough. He was living with the consequences of reality. When you watch 1954's The Caine Mutiny, filmed later in his career, you aren't just seeing a great actor. You are seeing a man who actually understood the terrifying isolation of command at sea. In the famous strawberry scene, where Captain Queeg breaks down, Bogart strips away every layer of the tough guy mask. He shows us the fear, the exhaustion, and the brilliance of a man who has seen too much. Look at the way he fumbles with the steel ball bearings in his hand. That wasn't just a prop. It was Bogart bringing the chess master's precision to a man whose mind was falling apart. He showed a generation of men returning from the horrors of World War II that toughness wasn't about being indestructible. It was about being broken and still finding a way to do the job. This was the ultimate Bogart code. He didn't just play characters. He used his own trauma to give the 20th century a face he could recognize. The forensic legacy, the 20th century man. As we look back at the films of the late 40s and 50s, like The Treasure of the Sierra Madre or In a Lonely Place, we see Bogart moving further away from the studio's tough guy blueprint. In The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, he plays Fred C. Dobbs, a man consumed by greed and paranoia. It is a terrifying performance because Bogart allows himself to look ugly, desperate, and small. If you look at the forensic detail in his eyes during the gold dust scenes, you aren't seeing a movie star, you are seeing the breakdown of the human spirit. Bogart fought the studio to play this role, even though they thought it would ruin his image. This was his final chess move. By destroying his own leading man image, he gained complete artistic freedom. He proved that the only way to be a legend was to be willing to kill the legend every time the camera rolled. In A Lonely Place, he plays Dixon Steele, a screenwriter suspected of a brutal murder. The performance is widely considered his most personal. Bogart plays the character with a violent, unpredictable edge that many believe was a reflection of his own frustrations with the Hollywood machine. Look at the forensic evidence in the scene where he almost kills a man in a fit of road rage. It is raw, it is uncomfortable, and it is entirely honest. He was no longer the black hat of the 1930s westerns. He was the complex, flawed, and deeply human heart of the noir era. He didn't just survive the studio system, he dismantled it from the inside out. He forced them to value performance over perfection, and truth over typecasting. When he finally left us in 1957, he didn't just leave a filmography. He left a map for how to survive in a world that is constantly trying to put you in a box. He showed us that the smartest move on the board isn't to play by the rules, it's to change the game entirely. The reset conclusion, beyond the trench coat. Humphrey Bogart was the world's most famous ghost, a man who lived in the gap between the legend Hollywood sold and the history he actually lived. By looking at these films, the failure of the Oklahoma Kid, the strategy of High Sierra, the brilliance of the Maltese Falcon, and the vulnerability of the Caine Mutiny, we see that the truth isn't found in a single frame. It's found in the buckling rivets of his career. It's found in the fact that he was a high society intellectual who chose to play the outcast because he knew the outcast was the only one telling the truth. The frontier isn't just a place in the West. It's the boundaries between what we remember and what actually happened. We've crossed that line today. We've left the unsinkable lies of the Titanic and entered the smoke-filled reality of the 1940s. If you enjoy this line of videos, let me know in the comments. What would you like to see next? Subscribe, like, and stay engaged. See you in the next one.